Okay, so again, thank you so much for inviting me and thanks for the introduction. I'm happy to be here at this really exciting conference. So today I'm going to be sharing preliminary findings from my current ongoing project about a tea house in Lahore, Pakistan, that was not only the most important literary salon in modern Pakistan, but was during the 1977 military coup, a hotbed for resistance against the state. So in 1977, General Zia-ul-Haq installed himself as Pakistan's sole political authority. With the coup, Pakistan was transformed into an authoritarian Islamic state by quelling resistance and eliminating any independent institutions. Military courts that dispensed arbitrary rulings were used to instill fear in the population. Political activity was punished by public lashing and 7 years rigorous imprisonment. Hand amputation, death by stoning, execution, and torture were common punishments. And fear was a very intentional component of this military regime. As Zia himself said, martial law should be based on fear. It's also worth noting, especially in light of American foreign policy of the 20th century and beyond, that the Zia regime was supported by the United States, with the Ronald Reagan administration providing $3.2 billion in military aid. So I went to Pakistan as visiting faculty in the humanities department at the Lahore University of Management Sciences after finishing up my first book on the Communist Party affiliated worker cooperative Indian Coffee House and focusing on how the New Delhi location of this firm fostered resistance against India's period of dictatorship in the 1970s. That book is called Bring Resistance and is available in Cambridge University Press. And the coffee house I examined in my first book was part of this chain of cafes established by British plantation owners to weather the empire-wide commodities export crisis of the 1930s. One of the locations ended up in Pakistan after partition, and I was really curious to know whether during Pakistan's military dictatorship, which occurred around the same time as India's emergency, whether there was a similar movement against the dictatorship launched from the cafe culture. And I found only 3 secondary academic sources that even mention the Pak Tea House, only one of which is in English. And so I spoke with some colleagues who work on urban studies in Lahore, and one of them invited me to Lahore to find out for myself, since there's a very small literature on cafe culture in Pakistan. And I must admit that when I went onto the ground and I started working in archives and doing oral history interviews, I was rather surprised by what I found. I did not find any evidence of contentious politics springing forth from the Pak Tea House, but I did uncover what the narrators I spoke with called cultural work, or the more Maoist inclined narrators called a cultural front. So fully aware of the consequences of contentious politics against the Zia military dictatorship, artists and intellectuals who gathered in Lahore's cafes decided to shift from contentious politics to a different set of tactics to create anti-authoritarian art and poetry. So the narrators told me that they saw this artistic and literary movement not just as a local response to Zia, but against the general category of dictators propped up by a hypocritical United States. And they saw themselves as part of a global project to expose this hypocrisy through their art. So as a historian and social theorist, I always find myself asking 2 questions for every project. I know you're really only allowed one, but there's always in my mind the historical question and then the more theoretical question. And in this project, empirically, I want to know why politics in the Pak Tea House took the form of a cultural front rather than the student movement, trade unionism, and other forms of contentious politics I was expecting to find before heading to Pakistan. But this also begs, I think, a broader theoretical question, and that is, in this fraught context of military dictatorship propped up by US hegemony, which again was not unique to Pakistan during this conjuncture, what are the possibilities for local resistance? So to help me think through this question, in the project, I read Louis Althusser's concept of the ideological state apparatus on a global scale by using Antonio Gramsci's theory of hegemony, Frantz Fanon's post-colonial class structure, and world systems analysis to show the role development ideologies played in the establishment of hegemonic ISAs through US influence, which created concrete subjects to the hegemon. Then through Althusser's concept of interpolation, I show how the artistic and literary work that was created by regulars of the Plys House undid what the ISA had created by offering a form of resistance, but also remaking the political subjecthood of the participants of the Café culture in the process. So in each systemic cycle of accumulation, there's this dominant ideology that legitimates the world hegemon. And in the post-war period, the United States, as part of it, the constitution of its new global hegemony, pitched economic development as this alternative to British imperialism and the means by which the US would eventually, quote unquote, liberate the rest of the world through free market capitalism. And so through this ideology of economic development, the world hegemon was able to constrain how different political leaders across the global South were able to dominate their own subjects, and thereby were successfully undermined the radical aims of national liberation. So economic development as ideology, I contend, is inherently contradictory in that it's one of the defining ideologies of US hegemony, but at the same time, it also allows moral grounds for global rule and also to foster these dependent relationships with global South states. But the spirit of development was very much embraced by anti-colonial actors to create anti-systemic challenges to nationalist movements, to newly independent states, and generally to the global order of the mid-20th century. And for political leaders of the global South, these development ideologies that were adopted after independence were mostly consistent with the idea this idea that economic growth through capitalist development is not only obtainable, but desirable. As Althusser contends, the ideological state apparatus functions massively and predominantly by ideology, but also by repression, even if ultimately, but only ultimately, this is very attenuated, concealed, and symbolic. So as all of us are, I think, well aware, Althusser famously contends that there's no such thing as a purely ideological apparatus. So there are these physical repercussions and punishments that are meted out to those who resist the dominant ideologies. And by the 1970s, with social movements across the globe escalating demands for social justice, we see across the global South the ideologies of development increasingly backed by repression as US hegemony begins to unravel. And so when we see these cracks begin to appear in the hegemonic apparatus, consent is no longer sufficient, and dominant classes, whether they're within the global South or more global, maintain their moral authority and resort to corruption, fraud, and in some cases force. So to examine this theory of the global ISA, I'm looking to this group of artists and intellectuals who gathered in the Plys House in Lahore, Pakistan in the late 1970s. And while this might seem like a significant jump in unit of analysis from very big global thinking to one particular tea house located in one city, Althusser's theory of the ISA does lend itself to this type of case study. So influenced by Lacan, Althusser's ISAs named subjects as constituting concrete individuals, and the tea house regulars became this group constituted by the ISA who through their art and their intellectual exchanges came to resist and renamed themselves against the world hegemon. And because ideology interpolates individuals as subjects, even this macro reading of the ISAs as the one that I've posited in this project suggests that the action taking place is actually on the level of the individual, not on the level of the world economy. So making this macro-micro link from the constituting ideology of the world hegemon to the individual subjecthood of the denizens of the Café culture has some precedence of in the work of Frantz Fanon, who, similarly influenced by Lacan, saw the effects of colonization as a source of pathology for the colonized racialized subject. So to better understand how artists and intellectuals responded to the military coup through the Café culture, I constructed an original database based on archival sources and oral histories. And on the slide, you can see the different archives in which I worked if there's interest. And to complement and triangulate these archival sources, I conducted so far 12 oral histories, but this is still ongoing work with different artists, poets, and political activists who frequented the Plys House in the 1960s and 70s. The narrators are exclusively male, because the cafe culture was a very, very male space, which I hope we get to talk about. And I am reaching out to female artists who were excluded from the spaces of the cafe culture, but who are nonetheless very political in their painting for the most part. And the oral histories were conducted in the homes of the narrators, and the duration of the conversations ranged from a little over to an hour to at most 4 hours. And the interviews were conducted in the language with which the narrator felt most comfortable, which meant that 3 interviews were in English, 8 were in Urdu, and 1 was in this mixture of English, Urdu, and Punjabi. But everything's been translated into English for the presentation, and I have put the transliterated Urdu on slides, so anyone with Urdu proficiency can reference the actual words of the narrators. So I'm going to tell you now a little bit about what Plys House was like in the 1970s. It was described to me as the house of artists, the house of poets and creative writers, and the hub of intellectuals. One narrator told me that in the cultural history of Lahore, Plys House shines out like a diamond. For some, Plys House was an addiction. There was a 2-story cafe, and on the upper story, there used to be a sitting space where it would host book launches of poets' work, and people from small cities who would come to Lahore who wanted to be poets or artists would come immediately to the Plys House and just hang around there because well-known writers would gather daily. And as one narrator recalled, you would walk in, and then on the table in the right-hand corner, Intezar Hussain would always be sitting there. And so aspiring artists would come to seek advice from the famous artists who would gather in the Plys House. All people from small cities with their poetry, their painting, whatever they do, they would try to talk to someone who was more senior and would look at their work. The distinction of the Plys House, I was told, was that anyone coming from any part of the world could visit Plys House in order to find writers and intellectuals sitting there, having conversations, exchanging poetry, and having intellectual debates. Every night.
Kristin, I'll just 2 minutes approximately. I know you've interrupted, but yes, you know.
Yeah. I think I'll just talk a little bit about, since I know that we're interested in intoxicants, I'll talk a little bit about the parties and then maybe skip ahead to the conclusion. But so every night was a party in the Plys House. And as one narrator put it to me, okay, you would go there and have tea, but you can't really have tea like all evening. So the conversations in the Plys House were not very much fueled by tea, but also by cannabis, hashish, and alcohol. And even the waiters and the staff would partake in the fun. And most of them, one narrator told me, would either smoke a joint with us or have a sip of beer or have a drink and then go back to work. So it was this atmosphere of open drugs and alcohol. And one novelist told me that he and his friends used to ask the waiters for an empty teapot, which they would covertly fill with whiskey because whiskey had the same color and consistency of tea. And there was a lot of, a lot of conversations were fueled by both alcohol and, marijuana. So, but it was also this place that wasn't just sort of a very happening literary and art salon, but also a place for political meetings. So one narrator would describe that every group had its fixed tables and said to me, the Maoists would sit here and the Leninists would sit there. And it was known as this very secular and left space, known for its student politics in the 1970s. And so professors would come, which would attract left-leaning students who would come to talk about organizing the student movement and seek advice from the more senior academics who would frequent the Plys House. So it was this space that linked the art scene of Lahore to left politics through this kind of atmosphere of alcohol and marijuana. So, but after the coup, obviously a lot of this had changed. There was really severe censorship, which I can skip over briefly and then circle back to that. Because I think what's most important is that in response to this, poets and artists chose to express themselves through the work. And new literary movements and new artistic movements sprung forth from the Plys House in response to the military coup. And even artists who were a bit apolitical after the coup, because there were these two factions of the literary scene of Lahore, one that was very engaged in left politics and one that was sort of an art for art's sake kind of movement and tied to the idea of nation building. And both of them, rethought their their platform and thought that, you know, art had to be political in this particular moment. But the reason, the register of this politics, which was very interesting to me to learn this, was not so much about directly opposing Zia al-Haq as the military dictator, but really about you know, pushing back against the Reagan administration that supported him and seeking affinity in other places across the global South that were experiencing similar ideals. So the way that one Maoist trade unionist explained to me that art was very much about left politics, and that it wasn't about local concerns about the dictatorship, but about this what was the words that were used were a third world solidarity. But one novelist said to me, and I hope that I have enough time to share this quote because I found it very powerful, that one of my novels, it discusses ideals. All the generations, all the youth, they're in search of an ideal. And ideals are those which are never fulfilled. If they're fulfilled, they're not ideals. Ideals are dreams and they're very essential. You know, and so he told me that my generation doesn't have any ideals, but they had a whole lot of them. And so he said, Patrice Lumumba, Sukarno, Ho Chi Minh, Mao Zedong, the whole world was emerging at this time, and Palestine. I myself, meaning the writer who was speaking to me in 1975, went to Beirut to join the PLO, and I never escaped the war. So that was a level of commitment, and people would go to Vietnam to fight Diem and things like that. We were totally aware of the global atmosphere. So for the narrators, this struggle was inextricable from the question of neo-imperialism, and they were really aimed at challenging the kinds of structures and ideas that sustained this alliance between US neo-imperialism and dictatorships across the global South. And so, you know, I did want to talk a little bit about why this didn't translate into traditional contentious politics, but I don't think I have time for that. So I'll just wrap up by saying that, you know, during these times of authoritarian back into, very unfortunately, when contentious politics becomes dangerous, the visible work to be done is on the cultural front. And we can see through the example of this literary movement and the cafe culture in Lahore in the late 70s, that the art and the conversations and the poetry that was created through the cafe culture of Lahore did important work, not just to sustain the Pakistani left through this very exceptionally repressive period of Pakistan's history, but that they had these very cosmopolitan concerns, and their struggle was this ontological one that was grounded in a global conceptualization of opposing US imperialism from where they were located in this one cafe in Lahore. And so, you know, not only did they try to offer resistance on a global scale, but in the process, they also remade their own political subjecthood and created these vibrant literary and artistic movements. So thank you, and thank you for bearing with me as I tried to, you know, race through this. And I'm really looking forward to continuing the conversation with everyone and looking forward to critical feedback and to questions. So thank you so much.